Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 9 quarterback rankings for the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to start off by talking about some news around the National Football League as it pertains to Thursday Night Football, tonight's game between the Green Bay Packers and San Francisco 49ers. We'll talk about a couple pieces of information regarding that game, injuries, players that are going to potentially miss. Outside of that, I also wanted to go ahead and talk about a couple players on my wide receiver rankings video yesterday. Prior to making that video, there wasn't any relevant information. Then after I posted, all of a sudden there's information about players missing, quarterbacks missing. We'll talk about that and kind of rectify some of those rankings. Outside of that, of course, we'll move on to the quarterbacks. We'll talk about matchups and how many points opposing teams, defenses in specific, are giving up to quarterbacks thus far this season in a 4-point per passing touchdown format on average per week. We'll talk about the most advantageous matchups, and of course, we'll talk about potential streaming options and why you might want to stream against a specific defense. Then after that, we'll talk about my much anticipated top 16 quarterback rankings on the week. Again, there are going to be 4 teams on bye, being the Cincinnati Bengals, the Philadelphia Eagles, the Los Angeles Rams, and the Cleveland Browns. 2 of those guys, Joe Burrow and Carson Wentz, has been in this top 16 conversation for the last couple weeks. So again, you'll be missing those, and hopefully you'll be able to pick up a backup and stream them this week and find success in doing so. So before we begin, click that like button down below. If you have not yet already, click that subscribe button. We're making 2020 fantasy football content here on the daily for the entirety of the season. If you're looking for a specific player, you can go down into the description of the video and find timestamps there. Again, click that subscribe button, click the bell notification button, lets you know when my latest content has dropped. Outside of that, if you're looking for extra content, you can go to the Patreon. You can find the Discord link down in the description in the first line for those of you who are interested in joining. Again, it is a really incredible community hub that we're building there. Thanks to the people at Discord helping us continue to build and grow this thing. It's going to be, the place to hang out in terms of finding fantasy football information and asking each other questions and being able to learn and build our teams as we progress throughout the 2020 season. Outside of that, let's get it going, shall we? All right, so let's start with some news around the National Football League for Week 9, specifically for Thursday Night Football, because again, this is the most prominent thing on today's schedule. As of right now, the San Francisco 49ers are going to have an entire backup of an offense. Why? Because the fact of the matter is a couple players on that team were tested positive for COVID-19. So Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, and Trent Williams all got popped yesterday and tested positively, along with Kendrick Bourne. So what exactly does that mean? Deebo Samuel wasn't slated to play, but Brandon Ayuk and Kendrick Bourne, both of the starting wide receivers for the 49ers, will be missing tonight's game. That 100% kills the offense, I think. It definitely hurts because you're still going to be missing Deebo and George Kittle and Jimmy Garoppolo. Now you're missing your left tackle against a team like the Green Bay Packers that sure can't stop the run, but are definitely pissed off about how things went against their division rival, the Vikings, the other day. It's going to be a pretty interesting lineup and to see exactly how this goes. Now, as for Aaron Jones, I think he is going to be a game time decision. He's going to try to warm up before the game starts. If he is ready to go and playing, I'm starting him. Again, we talked about it earlier in the week in the rankings. He's a top 10 guy every single week, regardless of the matchup. I think based on the fact that this offense doesn't have any other weapons, maybe outside of Devontae Adams and Robert Tonyan, it just seems like Aaron Jones is a plug-and-play guy that can absolutely score on any single down. With Jamal Williams out, A.J. Dillon out, just seems like a great play. So that covers that. The only other piece of information I wanted to mention was that Matthew Stafford tested positive as well. And because of that, Marvin Jones's value is diminished just slightly. I don't think it completely kills his value because Chase Daniel, the backup quarterback, we've seen him in their division, in the NFC North for the last couple of years with the Chicago Bears as a backup when Mitch Trubisky's gone down. He's come in and played well. He's produced a couple great games here and there and has definitely utilized the best players on the field, being Marvin Jones Hawkinson for the Lions this year. So as of right now, it just seems like I'm not too worried about it. I think Marvin Jones is still a decent play, but he definitely loses some value. Okay, so now that we've covered that, we can go ahead and move on and start talking about matchups at the quarterback position for Week 9 of the 2020 fantasy football season. So talking about which teams are giving up the most points to opposing quarterbacks in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. We have ourselves, of course, the Seattle Seahawks. This is a good thing for Josh Allen. For those of you who have Josh Allen, you have seen that progressively over the last month of the season, he has gotten worse and worse in total overall productivity. The passing touchdowns are disappearing. The interceptions are continuing to rise. And yes, even though he can get some points on the ground, he is not producing as well as he has in the past. So that being said, this is probably the best opportunity that Josh Allen is going to get to kind of right the ship in the correct direction. Again, he does have a bye week coming up, but he also has tougher matchups coming down the line with Pittsburgh and stuff. So hopefully he can kind of get a little bit more confidence throughout this game. I know they're probably going to be missing John Brown, so it'll be up to Stephon Diggs and Cole Beasley. Hopefully they'll get that going. The Atlanta Falcons obviously give up a lot of points. Drew Lock would be able to take advantage of that matchup if, in fact, he's ready to play and actually shows up to the game, unlike the other weeks that the Denver Broncos had prior to this, of course, this last week against the Chargers. The Jacksonville Jaguars defense will unfortunately have their hands full this week because, again, Deshaun Watson, Brandon Cooks, Will Fuller, that offense has been humming as of late in terms of scoring points. They might not be able to win games, but at least they're scoring and giving us fantasy value. The Chargers, of course, will be taking on Derek Carr and the Las Vegas Raiders offense, who definitely did pull out a squeaky win against the Cleveland Browns, but nonetheless, it is a W. They will probably be able to be a little bit more efficient this week in terms of the passing game because the weather won't be such a problem, so that's something to keep an eye on. The Saints against Tom Brady. Again, they're giving up 2.7 passing touchdowns per game. I always talk about their secondary not being able to cover. It is not a myth. It is a fact. Tom Brady with Antonio Brown, if he gets Chris Godwin back this week, should be a great play. The Vikings, again, they'll be taking on Chase Daniel. I would have loved to see Stafford play against them this week, but fortunately won't be the case. Cam Newton versus the Jets, not a bad matchup at all as a streaming option, especially considering a lot of you may have him available in your league this week. Then we'll talk about the Houston Texans. I don't think Jake Luton is going to be able to take care of that, but then we have Herbert against the Raiders, and we have Matt Ryan versus the Broncos. So those are the easier matchups on the week. Now, when we talk about some of the tougher matchups, of course, the Indianapolis Colts, a defense that is very, very sound as of right now in terms of, all three facets of the game. Special teams, offense, defense, they're getting it done. They're an efficient team, and they're definitely proving that over the first half of the season. Now, the question is, what exactly will the Baltimore Ravens be able to do? They're coming off a game in which they ran for over 200 yards against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. So where exactly does that leave them against the Indianapolis Colts? I think they'll still be in a pretty good spot. I still think that Lamar Jackson, as he's warming up throughout the season, just finally surpassed 200 passing yards this past week, turned over the ball a couple times. I still think that he's got himself a pretty good opportunity this week to produce against the Indianapolis Colts defense and secondary in specific. Of course, the Patriots, they'll take on Sam Darnold. I'm not really worried about that. Tampa Bay will, they'll probably send a little bit of heat at Drew Brees. The coverage of that secondary has played progressively better and better. But again, Michael Thomas returning is going to be something of an interesting sight there. The Rams on a bye week. The Chicago Bears, they take on Ryan Tannehill. Again, Ryan Tannehill has been one of the most consistent quarterbacks over the last 17 games of the NFL regular season. So there's something to keep an eye on there. Outside of that, these are some of the tougher matchups. Kansas City, Carolina, both playing against each other. Miami, interestingly enough, when we'll talk about it with Kyler Murray, Miami does not give up a lot of points to opposing offenses in general. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on. So now that we've covered that, we can go ahead and move on and return back to our top 16 quarterback rankings for week 9 of the 2020 fantasy football season. Again, remember, rankings are always subject to change. You can go ahead and join us Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, kickoff with Kirchhoff. We'll talk about updated rankings and all that kind of jazz before kickoff on Sunday mornings, every weekend. All right. Sounds good. Let's get into it, shall we? My number one quarterback on the week is Russell Wilson. Shouldn't be a surprise. Why? Because in the first 7 games of the season, he has thrown 26 passing touchdowns. He is on pace to not only break every single record in terms of passing touchdowns in NFL history, he's on pace for 59 passing touchdowns this season. Sure, there could be a little bit of regression coming down the line, but the way I see it, he is keeping up with the greats, with Mahomes, with Peyton Manning, and Tom Brady, the other 3 quarterbacks to only do it in NFL history. So as of right now, not really worried. Russell Wilson, last week, 261 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns against the division rival in which he smacked them, got himself 23 rushing yards. It's continuing to get better. And to be honest, when you play against the defense like the Buffalo Bills, sure, it may be a little bit of a tougher matchup as their secondary has been, known for being able to stop opposing quarterbacks. They're a little beat up right now. Again, you still have Micah Hyde dealing with the concussion. You still have Josh Norman that's probably going to be out. It's going to be up to Tre'Davious White. I know Matt Milano is still dealing with injury every single week. They're a little bit beat up defensively. I think Russell Wilson, this offense that is absolutely just destroying teams, will be able to once again take care of it. He is my number one quarterback on the week and a guy that I'm absolutely confident starting week in and week out here. Patrick Mahomes is my number 2 quarterback on the week, mainly because, again, outside of Russell Wilson, there really isn't any other quarterback that are better in the National Football League right now. And for fantasy purposes, Patrick Mahomes reestablished himself in Week 8 against the New York Jets. He had the best game of his season thus far with 416 passing yards and 5 passing touchdowns with 0 interceptions. Never had to run the ball in that game. Usually when Patrick Mahomes is in a tougher matchup, when the pass rush is getting after him, the coverage is playing well, he has to make plays with his legs. The fact that he had to just do nothing, just sit in the pocket and let it fly, just goes to show just how bad the Jets are, but how great Patrick Mahomes has become over the years. Regardless, they take on the Carolina Panthers this upcoming week. I still think that, of course, regardless of anything, Patrick Mahomes is an automatic start just based off of his talent, the talent that surrounds him, and the matchup. I'm not too worried about it. I think they'll be able to, dice up that Carolina secondary. We have ourselves Deshaun Watson as our number 3. Coming off of the bye week, takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jacksonville Jaguars, like we mentioned before, give up the 5th most points to opposing quarterbacks this season in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. So where exactly does that leave Deshaun Watson? I know many of you guys who owned Deshaun Watson early in the season definitely were a little bit turned off by his potential production and the outcomes of some of those games. Now, of course, they have a substantially losing record, 1-6 if I'm not mistaken. And though that's the case, they're probably going to be in every single contest trying to come from behind. Against the Jacksonville Jaguars, you probably won't have to worry about it, but the way I see it, Deshaun Watson's probably, like he did a couple weeks back when he played against the Jacksonville Jaguars, going to put 30-plus points on them. Deshaun Watson in the last couple weeks has been pretty productive. He's had 4 consecutive games of 300 passing yards and 5 consecutive games of 2 passing touchdowns. So again, he has been on a little bit of a heater as of late. He plays against Jacksonville coming off the bye week. I think, again, a division rival is going to definitely impose his will on their defense. We have ourselves Kyler Murray at number 4, another one of these quarterbacks coming off of the bye week. Again, Kyler Murray has a couple things going for him this season, besides the fact that he has himself averaging 62.4 rushing yards per game, which, if he continues to stay on this pace, is going to be very close to surpassing 1,000 rushing yards and be the 3rd quarterback in NFL. My goodness, the 3rd quarterback in NFL history to do that would be absolutely insane. Even just saying it just makes me think, wow, Kyler is just, he's insane. But regardless, the other stat that I wanted to mention, as of right now, many fantasy owners look at Kyler Murray's stats and think, okay, he only has 13 passing touchdowns. When we talk about Russell Wilson's doubled that number. But where, Kyler Murray kind of makes up the ground and continues to succeed, besides the 62 rushing yards per game, is the fact that he scored 7 rushing touchdowns in the first 7 games of the season. So he's not only accompanying his couple touchdowns in the passing game with a respective, couple 60 yards, that's 6 points, but an extra 6 points in the rushing touchdown category, So that's an extra 12 points per week that a lot of other quarterbacks aren't able to get. As right now, they play against the Miami Dolphins. The Dolphins are giving up the least amount of points to opposing teams this season. Just in general, I think they're only giving up like 17.8 points per game. That leads the league. After them, it's like Indianapolis and some of the tougher defenses. So it's a little bit of a surprise to see Miami play that well. And I think Kyler Murray still will be able to produce against them. But again, Miami's defense is starting to trend in the right direction. We move on to number 5, Aaron Rodgers, playing on Thursday Night Football. Like we mentioned a little bit earlier, he takes on the San Francisco 49ers, and that team is going to be completely gutted in terms of talent offensively. That could give Aaron Rodgers more and more opportunities to get the ball back and score. We've seen Aaron Rodgers play out of his mind this season, and the fact that they didn't go out and bring another weapon in is still going to bother me. But regardless, he is still produced like he has an all-star cast surrounding him with only one really good receiver and nobody else contributing. Aaron Rodgers this past week against the Minnesota Vikings, in a game in which, of course, Minnesota dominated the time of possession, he still had himself a great game. 291 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 9 rushing yards. Thus far this season, Aaron Rodgers has thrown 20 passing touchdowns. To put it in perspective, last season overall, he had only 26. He is on pace to shatter last year's overall production. He's on pace to have at least 40 passing touchdowns this year. Aaron Rodgers is playing out of his mind. And typically when he's coming off of a loss, he goes ahead and he delivers the pain to the opposing team. I think the revenge game this upcoming week should be sweet for him. Justin Herbert's my number 6. So again, Herbert's been playing fantastic football. Ever since he's come in as a starter, he's really taken over. When we talked about it with Keenan Allen last week, he has truly made Keenan Allen one of the best receiving options this in this season. I mean, really, in terms of fantasy productivity, Keenan Allen is up there because of the contributions of Justin Herbert. Now, last week, Justin Herbert obviously had a little bit of a tough loss at the end of the game there because the defense of the Los Angeles Chargers couldn't hold, but I love to see that. Honestly, as a Chargers fan, sure, we might lose games, not a big deal, but in terms of fantasy, when I put on my fantasy cap, I think to myself, if you're a Justin Herbert owner, you want the Los Angeles Chargers defense to suck because it is going to put the emphasis to go out and score every single possession for the Chargers offense in order to maintain any sort of lead. So again, they take on the Las Vegas Raiders, a defense that isn't known for stopping quarterbacks and being one of the best. As of right now, Justin Herbert's coming off of a game in which he had 278 passing yards and 3 passing touchdowns, 21 rushing yards. That's going to continue to build. But this season, Justin Herbert, averaging 303 passing yards per game, has had 4 consecutive games of 3+ touchdowns. Just seems to me that Justin Herbert's on a streak that you really can't stop him on. My number 7 quarterback on the week is Big Ben Roethlisberger. And as of right now, he's got one of the juicier matchups on the week. The Dallas Cowboys are giving up a lot of points to opposing quarterbacks, and it shouldn't really be a surprise. That defense has definitely been struggling. In fact, that defense has given up 2+ touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks in each of the last 3 weeks. So again, they've definitely been struggling. Quarterbacks playing against them like Carson Wentz, sure, he made a bunch of mistakes, turned over the ball a lot, but I don't think a team like the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to be going into that matchup and struggling as much. I think Ben Roethlisberger playing as consistently as he has this season is probably going to find himself in one of the better positions. If he has Deontay Johnson on the field, of course, he is a better play. But regardless, I still think that with Claypool, Juju Smith-Schuster, Eric Ebron, and James Conner, this offense is still going to be able to be very productive and give fantasy owners a lot of points from, of course, Ben Roethlisberger, who's having a little bit of a resurgence since being knocked out of the 2019 season with that elbow injury. Of course, he's really reestablished himself and given himself that much more value in fantasy. So again, as my number 7, it really shouldn't be a surprise as the Dallas Cowboys are going to be in a little bit of trouble this weekend. We have ourselves Josh Allen at number 8. Of course, in a 4-point per passing touchdown format, we love the idea of Josh Allen being able to run and exploit defenses and collect yards. But the question is going to be, what Josh Allen are we going to see on Sunday? With the Seattle Seahawks giving up the second most points to opposing quarterbacks, the question pretty much is, are we going to see the Josh Allen that can, air it out a little bit, or are we going to see one that's, going to run it, throw some interceptions, and maybe score a late touchdown on the ground? Because if that's the case, that's what we saw last week. I mean, against the Bill Belichick-led defense of the New England Patriots, it pretty much was, hey, Josh Allen, try not to lose this the game. He threw for 154 passing yards. Didn't pass it for a touchdown, had an interception, had 23 rushing yards on 10 attempts, not good enough. Ultimately, it's going to be a matter of what exactly can he produce against the defense that hasn't looked great this season. Now, that being said, they were firing on all cylinders against Jimmy Garoppolo this past week. Now, when Nick Mullins came in, it was a little bit of a different story. So I still think that Seattle's defense is still there. It may have been masked this past week, but it's still there and it's still present in my mind that they're probably going to have a couple holes that you could take advantage of. This season, every single quarterback has scored at least 2 touchdowns against Seattle's defense, except for Ryan Fitzpatrick. So again, just putting that in perspective, I think Josh Allen should have himself a pretty good week as my number 8. Number 9 is Lamar Jackson, and it's crazy to see how much regression we've seen from Lamar Jackson this season. Hopefully, late in the season, considering how favorable his schedule becomes, he will continue to at least get in the right direction. This past week against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense, 2 passing touchdowns, 208 passing yards, 65 rushing yards. Had himself overall a pretty good game in my eyes. Obviously, turning over the ball twice, throwing a pick 6, these are not things that you want to see, but as long as he continues to stay on pace, averaging 60 rushing yards per game and at least getting himself a couple touchdowns here and there throughout the air, I think that he's probably going to have himself still a pretty good game against Indianapolis' defense. But if we just think about what he did last year, Lamar Jackson had 36 passing touchdowns last year, 7 rushing touchdowns. That's 43 total touchdowns. As of right now, I think he's averaging maybe 2 touchdowns per game. Last year, it was like 2.8 touchdowns per game. So he was in that 3 range. That swing of 6 points, a couple extra rushing yards, that is the big difference. It's an 8-point swing almost to an extent every single week. And that's what we lost with Lamar Jackson. And unfortunately, until we see something else spark, we're going to have to rank him down here. But again, still a fantastic play. Still has a lot of upside. I still trust him as my number 9. Number 10 is Tom Brady, playing against the division rival, playing against the New Orleans Saints. I think, of course, I've talked about it a lot. The Saints give up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers and quarterbacks, the third most to quarterbacks in specific. Now, Every single quarterback playing against the Saints this season has thrown for 2+ passing touchdowns and at least 200 passing yards. So Tom Brady guarantees 2 touchdowns, 200 passing yards. That in itself, an easy number to at least eclipse. I mean, just this past week in which the offense struggled pretty heavily, had himself 279 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and was smashing his helmet against the bench on the sideline. So if in fact AB shows up, they get themselves a little bit more in tune in this offense, then you're going to have yourself a pretty good performance from Tom Brady in a back and forth matchup against New Orleans secondary that should honestly be easy considering how bad they've played in the back end of the season. Ryan Tannehill is my number 11, and there was a stat that I kind of alluded to earlier when we were talking about matchups playing against against Chicago's defense. In the last 17 games, okay, Ryan Tannehill has averaged 260 passing yards and 2.3 passing touchdowns per game. That kind of statistic, those numbers are just, I mean, what can you ask for more? Ryan Tannehill in the last 17 regular season games has been fantastic. This season was great. Since week 7 of the 2019 season has been great. And even against a tough defense like the Chicago Bears, I still think that there is a lot of room for Ryan Tannehill to improve on what he did last week. Last week wasn't the greatest numbers. He struggled heavily, and I think that offense definitely got behind pretty badly against a mediocre team like the Cincinnati Bengals. But again, if Ryan Tannehill's defense, specifically the secondary for the Tennessee Titans, are going to struggle, and maybe Nick Foles could take advantage of it, it's going to put more pressure on Ryan Tannehill to throw and make plays. I think, again, that always leads to success for them, whether it's play action-wise or whether it's just feeding their amazing wide receivers of A.J. Brown and Corey Davis right now. I still think Ryan Tannehill has a lot of value. Number 12 is Matt Ryan. Matty Ice hasn't looked great in a couple of weeks. Hopefully Calvin Ridley's coming back. If he doesn't, I think this is a little bit less of a viable matchup this week against Denver. I know Denver secondary isn't great, but if Matt Ryan could go against Carolina and not throw a single touchdown pass, struggle in the red zone, have to at least opt for field goals as often as they did. They're not going for it on 4th-and-1 situations. They're playing more passively, just trying to let their defense kind of dictate the game. I don't think that you're going to be able to do that against a lot of teams. I think the defense will fall apart eventually, and it's going to force Matt Ryan to have to, air it out a little bit more. Of course, them getting a bunch of rushing touchdowns for Gurley has siphoned a little bit of the value from Ryan. But I think as long as this offense can at least be tested and pushed to kind of have to come back instead of lead the entire game against Denver, I think there's going to have, at least a positive impact or overall productivity from Matt Ryan in terms of his fantasy numbers this week in comparison to last Thursday, of course. Moving on, we have a couple streaming quarterbacks that I'm comfortable running with this week. That's typically what this 13 to 16 range is. Starting off with Cam Newton, you play against the New York Jets. I mean, do I have to say any more? I really shouldn't have to. I mean, the fact that Cam Newton sure hasn't thrown a touchdown since week 3 of the 2020 fantasy football season is a little bit concerning. He's not averaging very many passing yards per game, but that's not where he finds his value. Where he finds his value in a 4-point per passing touchdown format is the fact that he's averaging 50 rushing yards per game and 1 rushing touchdown per game. That combination is an extra 11 points, similar to what we were talking about with Kyler Murray earlier this episode, averaging an extra 12 points per game on the ground. So again, when you get those extra 11 points and you accompany it with an extra 8 points in terms of 200 yards passing, you got yourself a 19-point quarterback that a lot of other quarterbacks are really struggling to kind of find that kind of value there. So again, keep in mind, I think Cam Newton against this sorry New York Jets defense should be able to pick up and play well. Derek Carr is my number 14. Again, the Los Angeles Chargers defense has not played well. Just talking about a couple of the quarterbacks that have definitely gone in on them in the last couple of weeks. Again, Los Angeles Chargers giving up the 6th most points to opposing quarterbacks. Drew Lock, 248 yards and 3 passing touchdowns. Gardner Minshew the week before, 173 yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Brady, 369 and 5. Drew Brees, 325 and 2. So again, quarterbacks in the last 4 games against them have definitely taken advantage of it. I think, again, Derek Carr could probably get back on track. This past week, it wasn't great with 111 passing yards and only 1 passing touchdown, but had himself 41 rushing yards, which was a little bit of a different thing. But again, the weather pretty much dictated that. Either way, I think Derek Carr gets back on track. Has been one of the more sneakier quarterbacks this year in terms of overall productivity. He's had a couple good games here and there, so I'm still confident that he can play well. We move on to Drew Brees as my number 15. Again, I think Drew Brees is a fantastic play if, in fact, Michael Thomas is going to play. Again, playing against a division rival for Drew Brees hasn't been something of trouble. I think their offensive line is going to hold up enough to where Drew Brees will have enough time to air the ball out, let Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas, Jared Cook, Taysom Hill be able to dominate against that secondary and that defense. I think there are still a couple holes in that defense that you could take advantage of. Obviously, you're not going to find that in terms of running the ball, but through the air is where they're going to have to find their success. Drew Brees has done it more than a handful of times against Tampa Bay. I'm not too worried about it. I still think he's a great pickup and play this week as a streaming option. The last option I wanted to mention is Teddy Bridgewater. Now, here's the thing about Teddy B. Again, he didn't have a great week on Thursday night. A lot of it had to do with the fact that he took a late hit and probably wasn't feeling himself for the entire second half. That being said, the question's going to remain, where is Teddy Bridgewater going to land if and when Christian McCaffrey is taking a lot of rushing touchdowns? Because when Christian McCaffrey was active earlier this season, we saw a couple games where he's stealing touchdowns on the ground, and it's taking away value from Teddy Bridgewater. Hopefully Bridgewater airs it out in the passing game, feeds the ball to McCaffrey and or Davis, gets himself extra yardage there, and then starts to utilize, of course, his two biggest threats, DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson. So pretty much, hopefully, that lands in the right direction. So those are my top 16 quarterback rankings for week 9 of the 2020 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you haven't yet already, subscribe to the channel, click that like button down below. And until a little bit later this afternoon, we'll talk about tight ends. Thank you, everybody. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.